Cool. So since it's on the hour, and I have the first question, you asked me to look into some some numbers for the free pool mirrors who are about to end somewhere in March, I think.
Yep.
Turns out about 84% of our mirrors that we run are free, so those would go away, which is of course a huge difference in what we need to be able to handle and if we need to optimize the application or not. So yeah, do we want to be able to handle all of those mirrors, or do we just, yeah?
So I kind of think that regardless of whether this is free or not, we should aim to be able to serve all of those. As in, long term, it doesn't really matter whether this is free or not. But short term, when we are like in a very big rush to actually make an impact, it does matter a lot whether we are going to tackle this immediately or not. So yeah, long answer.
The thing is, if we at some point we want to be able to handle this number of mirrors, I forget the numbers now, but I thought it was something around 37 million a week, of jobs per week.
Like that.
Yeah. If those would all be paying, then there would be a lot of money behind scaling up the infrastructure that does that.
That's true. That's true. But then again, it doesn't, from my perspective, what only matters here is that priority-wise, how are we going to tackle this? If this is not going to go away in March, then our priorities need to shift and we need to focus more on this, because ultimately it's going to affect our whole infrastructure. If it does go away, somewhere down the line, we want to be able to support this many jobs somewhere down the line, but that can be 2 years, it can be half a year, hopefully, if all of that is paid, or 5 years or never, right?
Yeah,
but somewhere down the line.
If 85% of those jobs leave now, then we've got some headroom to focus on on more impactful things first.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
It'd be interesting to know what percentage of those mirrors, because what I see kind of over and over and over is someone who's, and this is not obviously representative of everyone, but there is definitely a portion of this. Somebody wants to test GitLab. So they set up an Unreal Tournament mirror from GitHub, and they play around with GitLab for 20 minutes and they decide it's cool, but then they never visit it again. And then for the rest of time, we are busy cloning that repository. And I wonder if there'd be interest, I wonder if there's any sort of way that we can get some engagement stats on those free mirrors. What percentage of them have not been visited in a year, for example, as a metric, because I would not be surprised that was not really high.
I mean, there is also something to be said about set up and forget as well. I have a bunch of private repos on my own that I set up once, and they're doing various things like pulling and so on. And some of them I actually haven't visited for a year, if not longer. And I'm only relying on a notification to let me know when something fails. It has been passing all this time, so either I'm so good at this task, or our platform is so stable, or my notification failed and I haven't checked actually. But the point is, there are all those repos which are set up and forget, and they do serve a purpose. So it's a bit tough to make a decision that way, I think.
Yeah, and that's what triggered this discussion. Lots of these things have been set up into GitLab once and report CI status back to GitHub. And that's a valid usage of, we offer CI that way.
Yeah, that's the GitLab CI.
Is that based on pull mirrors? I thought that was not based on pull mirrors.
I think it is.
It has to be, right? If you're using GitLab CI on gitlab.com, you need to pull from a repository on GitHub.
The job that will do the actual mirroring, so the repository update mirror job, is the one that's going to be pulling in the changes, if I remember correctly.
Right. Okay. So I thought it was just, I thought we weren't being used for the repository for that stuff. I mean, you know, I thought the repository is going straight to GitHub.
And that's also why Jason is suggesting that we delay this deprecation for that specific use case alone.
Case.
Yeah, but it's kind of hard to actually make a decision what is for that valid use case and what is not.
Is that a pull mirror, or is there like is there a way that we could like get a webhook from GitHub to kind of let us know when that repository's changed?
We get that, but and then we trigger an update as in now.
Right, but and then the rest of the time, do we just poll like a normal pull mirror, or?
Yeah, I think like that. I would need to check to make sure, but I think we do.
Right, because if we know that we're going to get the webhook, then maybe we could just skip doing the pulls on those repositories, if you follow the logic.
Yeah. Do we know that if that's worth it? Because those tend to be active repositories. And
but if there's, I mean, do we know that they're like? It would be interesting to do could we look at? Do we know where the webhook comes into? Like, could we do a query to see? Like how many times a repository gets pulled on average versus the number of times we get a webhook for it?
Yeah, that's what I'm asking. We could probably check that because yeah, there needs to be an incoming webhook for that.
Yeah, that'd be quite an interesting thing to pull.
Yeah, in general, like just looking at these numbers, this looks ridiculous. Like I'm going to try and transfer this into or translate this into money somehow. I don't know how, but we'll figure it out. And that's going to be very telling. It's a large piece of the pie. Cool. There
are just so many cool jobs. It actually, if it's allowed, it kind of completely changes what we need to focus on.
Yep. It really is going to have a heavy impact.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to put this here and then ask a question. The scaling Redis document, Andrew, that you started on earlier.
Yeah. Yes.
Maybe it's worth kind of going through it together, and while we are already in this call and spending time, right?
It's very much an overview, outline at the moment of a document, but I can share my screen and can go through it. You see that?
Yeah.
Cool. So I kind of just started jotting things down, but again, like it's not in any order, and it's certainly not complete, but I kind of wanted to state the things that I think are important. So like ideally, I would rather we didn't introduce like extra application logic that was like, if we're doing Redis sharding, then do this, and kind of having that all over the show. Because as soon as you have that, then people who don't know about it don't realize they have to have it, and things break, or kind of leaking abstractions. I'm a big fan of, we have a Redis server, and kind of what's behind that is Redis, and it might be Redis cluster, it might be Redis Sentinel, it might be like a standalone Redis. It doesn't really matter, but we're just talking Redis. And so that was one of the goals. And then another goal was like, if we can kind of keep, avoid extra complexity by having extra elements, that would be great in Omnibus. But you know, it looks like certainly for at least one of the Redis clusters, probably GitLab, Redis cluster would be the right way to go. And then that would require some changes to Omnibus, and there need to be reg tasks, a lot of documentation around it. Because the thing that people need to realize as well is that I've never actually operated a Redis cluster, but it's very different from a normal Redis, and it's got its own commands, and it's not the same thing. And that's actually also something that is really worth being aware of. So as far as I know, no one here has actually operated a Redis cluster.
No, and also it's very difficult pushing this down to our customers at some point as well. Because if you have to go into a job of explaining what what you should be using Redis Sentinel setup with for Redis cluster with Sentinel setup or Redis cluster, it's going to become a mess.
I mean, one thing that's kind of an interesting consideration, just a consideration, and this is all about proposals, but like, you know, if you strictly keep to like your Redis connection will give you Redis stuff, like I was saying, one of the options is that you could say that for the persistent Redis or the case where maybe cluster makes the most sense, you could get an enterprise Redis Labs, Google Cloud managed instance, right? And we kind of just take that all off our plate and we just handle, you know, that through that. Definitely worth considering.
I think that's something we should be seriously talking about for us as well, because the more we grow, the more this complex becomes, and I don't know whether it makes sense for us to run specifically this when we kind of expect that none of our customers are going to reach this scale at all. It feels like such a engineering waste, like engineering time waste to go through that. I think now we are finally going across that border of being too big for majority of our self-managed customers.
There you go. 5 nines. Yeah, I mean, it would be interesting to consider that, or you know, even that one, but definitely something worth considering, rather than, yeah, like you say. And then for those huge customers, you could say like, hey, you know, get your Redis Labs instance. But yeah, I mean, I hadn't thought about that before, but it's definitely worth putting into documents. Yep. So, and I just kind of put some assumptions in here. The first one, like, because this became clear in that meeting, like, I think a lot of the assumptions are kind of in my head in the meeting this morning, but one of them was that like Redis cluster cannot run Sidekick. So Sidekick cannot run on Redis cluster. And he's like, people have gone and created issues and said, my Redis, you know, Sidekick isn't working very well in Redis cluster. And he's gone, well, like, that's because Redis cluster is not Redis. And that's also something to be aware of. Like Redis cluster is a different product, right? So it's pretty different in a lot of ways. And then this was actually kind of an interesting one because I've quoted this a lot, and I'm sure you've all heard me say Redis can scale to 50,000 jobs per second. But then the part about this that I hadn't actually read that well before was that on a single dedicated Redis instance, you can get about 8,000 jobs a second, which is much lower than the 50,000, right? And so that's really interesting. It's still way, you know, we've got like 10x on that, you know, we're not like clipping that yet or anything like that, but it's much lower. The ceiling's much lower than I'd originally thought. So that's kind of defines that. And then another thing that came up in this call this morning was there was some arguments about, not argument, but there was some backwards and forwards about whether Redis Sentinel is HA. And like, certainly I would say for our availability, Redis Sentinel is HA. You know, we don't need to be not inventing here things, you know, that it's not that's not a problem. And likewise, you know, if you look at like really big applications running on the internet that have much higher availability than we do, they rely on Redis Sentinel and they manage just fine. So like I don't want us to kind of reinvent that.
To make it clear to Bob and Osvaldo who are here now, there was a mention that Redis is a single point of failure, but I think, and this is what Andrew is addressing, from the infrastructure side of things, Redis that we currently have running is highly available. It is a classic standard setup with Sentinels and so on. So from the application side, that might be the case, right? Like if the cluster goes away, how does the application behave? That's the question. But from the infrastructure side of things, we cannot say that Redis cluster is not going to go away because it is highly available.
Yeah. And then this is like a section.
One more question I had when you mentioned Redis cluster isn't Redis, but you also mentioned we want to keep the difference in the application as small as possible. Like that kind of doesn't work. Like if we decide to use Redis cluster, then there's going to have to be application changes, right?
There are, and the main one is around. There's two things really that are the biggest concern. One of them is like Lua scripting, but from what I've seen, the Lua scripting that we use is fairly basic at the moment. Maybe that'll change, but so basically the rule is, if you're using Redis cluster, if you have a command, all the keys in that command have to be on the same Redis node, right? So if you do a Lua script, all the things on there, and so that's kind of, that does impact the application. And I don't really have an answer to that yet. It's certainly something that I was starting to think about. Like the one thing that I was thinking, which is also like extra complexity, it was I had a proposal for it. This proposal, it's not great, but like I'd rather we didn't do this. But if we find that there's just stuff that we can't run in Redis cluster, then we could run the existing Redis persistent, which is like a non-cluster Redis, and then we start putting things in Redis cluster. But that's like, it's a bit of a dirty solution, I think. Like it would be better just to have everything together. But if we find that it's not possible, then we could just have like Redis single and Redis cluster, and on like a self-managed instance that actually both be the same instance, and on GitLab.com they would be like an actual cluster. You know, stuff that we know is cluster proof, and then stuff that's not. The other problem that I think you would have with this is that migrations would become very difficult, because you know, you'd have like some of the stuff would need to be transferred over to the cluster, and then other things will need to stay in the persistent, and it all gets a bit messy. But like I think it would be much better to explore the possibility of just having everything move across the cluster. Like the place that I originally encountered this was Gitter, because we really wanted to use Redis cluster, but we have these Lua scripts that have like dozens and dozens of different keys in the Lua script, and they're like really complicated. They're like, you know, 50-line long Lua scripts, which is a lot of Redis commands in loops, and it's like crazy stuff. And so we really struggled. We couldn't do Redis cluster because there was no guarantee that we could get the keys all on the same one. But I know that what I've seen, like the only Lua scripts, and Stan can probably comment on this, the only Lua scripts I've seen are super simple, like locking. They generally have like a single key, not like, you know, dozens of keys. And then there'd probably also be a bunch of multi-execs that we'd need to look at. But you know, we can look at those on an ad hoc basis and kind of and figure out if this is going to be a problem.
Yeah, by far the users of the Lua scripts looks like the exclusive lease, which is like, hey, I want to take a lease. I think we are looking at some Sidekick middlewares that try to deduplicate jobs, and those use Lua scripts as well. We're not using them yet, but we are looking at them.
That's who out of interest, Stan, who's doing that?
Well, that's somewhere in our queue. We were talking about it, but I don't think that we've
Yeah.
moved on it yet.
Yeah, we haven't used it. We just looked. There's a third. Somebody's created this plugin that seems like they put a lot of thought and
Oh,
effort into it.
yeah.
And they're using Lua scripts there, so that was one thing that we.
I was more concerned if it was like sort of duplication, like another team was working on the same thing.
No. It's
Okay.
just
Yeah. So I saw that. Yeah, and that's like a perfect case of like, you know, Lua's a pretty good thing for that, and you can do everything atomically. The reason why Gitter ended up having so many like Lua scripts is because inside a multi-exec block, you can't have conditionals, and sometimes it's really useful to have like well, if the value of this key is this, then do that, otherwise do this, and have that all atomically done inside the server, and you can't do that with multi-exec. But anyway, so just going back up to the top, so we're just going through this like very first cuts, because we're sort of struggling to get some questions on our first office hours. But I started writing down like all the sort of Redis scaling proposals that I foresee and have discussed with people. And it's very early. I'd really like to kind of flesh it out a lot, but I think the kind of general proposals are kind of sound, and then it's just building up what the problems with each one are and what the solutions are, and kind of figuring out. And the one thing that's worth noting is I think like the three Redises that we have all got very different solutions that would make sense for them. Like it's not like one size fits all. And so the first one that I addressed is the Redis cache, because I think that that's the easiest one for us to move on. Like there's two solutions, and they're both like fairly, like they both have like a low number of unknown unknowns, I think, or known unknowns at least. And the first is using Redis distributed, and you've commented on that quite a bit, Stan, and like that's one approach. And then the second is just to switch to Redis cluster. And I think that would also be fairly easy on our caching instance. You know, the issue that we saw the other day with S members, it's not going to help that. And earlier today, there've been a whole bunch of spikes on that instance as well, where we've seen 100% CPU. And I don't really know if anyone's got to the bottom of what that is, but I don't think it would help in either of those cases, but it would be, you know, spread out more wide. So that's that. And then the second one.
In the graph you're showing there, you mentioned Sidekick talking to Redis cluster, but that's not supported, so that would need to come out, right? Below, like.
Sorry, this is.
Not your favorite proposal.
This one over here.
Yeah.
So remember as well that Sidekick will be caching. So this is not for Sidekick queues. This is for Sidekick doing its caching. Yeah. So it's GitLab Rails, if you want, the mythical service that's split multiple ways. So, you know, it's that side of it rather than the actual. And this is terrible because it makes Redis cluster look like a single point of failure, but my mermaid skills are not that hot. And then Redis Sidekick. So this one, the two ways I think you could do it are you could either do it in the application. And so what I was imagining with that is that you kind of come up with some sort of identifier, and then you say, you know, we use the same attribution thing that we've used. So we could say, this is like a pipeline queue, or maybe we actually just use feature categories, and we just say, like all the pipeline stuff will go, like in the gitlab.com setup, all the pipeline stuff will go to this other one, and we have a little client middleware that routes the perform async to that queue. So like we're taking the complexity away from the developers, so developers don't have to think, oh, which queue do I need to post this to, or anything like that. It'll just be a middleware. But like, I don't even want to spend that much time on it, because the second proposal is what Sidekick tells you should do, and it's nice and clean, and you just plug something into the bottom of Sidekick. So they've got this pluggable Sidekick : client abstraction, And that just works really nicely, and it will just like chart everything for you. The only downside to that approach is that the API and basically is per Redis, right? So the API doesn't get fanned out. So, you know, when we run the commands like to go and delete jobs manually, we would have to run those against both instances.
Everywhere.
Yeah. And I don't know what would happen with our UI, like the Sidekick UI probably wouldn't work, I guess.
But if we add endpoints for that, as we've discussed, then that probably go away as well.
Yeah.
Well, not go away. We would need to deal with it there, but it would be.
Yeah.
It could be transparent for SRE.
Yeah, although if people went to the Sidekick user interface, you know, the one that we sort of embed, like that would not work. Maybe, you know, we could probably hack like a pull down at the top or something awful. But the other thing we could say is like for GitLab.com, like I don't think anyone else is going to use this. Well, that's a discussion we should have. And if no one else is going to use it, maybe just say for GitLab.com, you don't get the UI because it doesn't work very well on GitLab.com anyway.
The UI is only in the admin interface, and
yeah,
like why would we even bother with that?
Yeah, yeah. And but that looks, and the other thing that I was kind of surprised by, I mentioned this earlier, Stan, but I'll raise it with you, was I've been quoting this 50,000 Sidekick jobs rate quite a lot. But the second sentence of that is per Sidekick server, it's about 8,000. So we've got some growth on that, but certainly not all the way up to 50,000, like, you know, quite a bit down on that. So this is something we should probably start thinking about at some stage, or somebody at least, not necessarily us. And then I think the hardest of the three is what to do with the persistent Redis. And the choices that we have are, we can kind of continue with the strategy that we already use, which is just vertically partitioning Redis and saying, you know, like the way we've done, we obviously start off by splitting the cache from everything else, and then we split Sidekick off. And now, you know, we could say, well, everything to do with pipeline needs to go to, you know, we'll have a pipeline Redis connection. And if you're doing pipeline stuff, you have to do it there. But I kind of feel like we've reached the end of the road with like those divisions, because anymore, like when an application developer comes along and he just wants to put something in Redis, he needs to, or he or she, beg your pardon, needs to figure out where to like stick that thing. And that's complicated and error prone. And, you know, if one person uses one connection, the other uses the other, it might work in unit testing, but fail in integration tests or fail in production. And so I don't really think that we can add, like, there's no obvious partition that we can sort of cleave into the middle of Redis persist, as far as I can think. So I don't really like that proposal. The second proposal is that, and this is really only for the case that I discussed, where we find that there's stuff that we can't move to Redis cluster, then we just stand up Redis cluster and Redis persist, and we just start putting keys into Redis cluster, like maybe the session tokens and stuff like that, and everything that we know is cluster safe. But that, I think there would probably be quite a bit of concern around like migration, and obviously if we migrate, then if we migrate back, you know, rollbacks become really like dodgy during that process. And so I think that there's a lot of complexity around that we would need to think about really carefully, and I don't really like it. Also, again, application developers, they don't need to know, they don't want to know, oh, this key goes to Redis cluster because some other process will use Lua locking. And so there's a whole bunch of cognitive overhead that we want to rather avoid. And so I think that for the persistent Redis, I think that Redis cluster would probably be the best approach. But we, you know, I think, and I need to do all the homework, I think we'll have quite a long runway before we actually hit that point on the persistent Redis now, because we've taken a lot of stuff out of there. I haven't looked, it's pretty easy to check.
The nice thing about shared, like GitLab Redis shared state, it's called in the code, is that the developers need to talk Redis to it manually. They can't use Rails cache and so on. So we kind of have that, like a better control over that.
Yeah, but they still need to pick like the one or the other, right? And so like they need to know which is the right one for their application. One of these graphs are like not working at the moment.
Just a sidebar. Does Redis cluster just ship with Redis, or is it a whole different?
It's
binary.
if I remember correctly, because like that was one of the things that I was concerned about. Like I don't think there's a lot of people with operational experience of using it. I think it's a different binary. It's a good question, but I know it's got all these Ruby scripts that you kind of need to run in order to do anything. And if I remember correctly, those don't ship with normal Redis. Like, so there's like a whole bunch of commands that you run. So you invoke via these .rb, redis-rb. Where is it again?
I don't know that many people
Maybe
using
it is.
Is it part of it?
It looks like it is just a cluster enabled, yes. So it does ship with the default binary.
Yeah, I'm curious about all the, you know, we need to support in Go, we need to support in Ruby, we need to support all the like detection, failover, all that stuff. It gets
yeah, and there's a lot of this, you know, using Redis trib.rb and like there's a lot of like stuff that we'll need to learn and master. And obviously this is really critical infrastructure. So I think the longer we can do without it, I think the better. But I think, Stan, one of the things that like this is about is there's a lot of kind of conversations around like Redis, and like it's kind of firstly setting out like expectations and timeframes and like how urgent is this, so that everyone's kind of thinking in the same direction, you know, rather than sort of pulling in different directions. So it's not necessarily something we're going to do tomorrow or, you know, this quarter or whatever, but it's just kind of
right. But it's obvious
like
we need to do something, because, you know, the cache spiking to 100% is going to bite us any day now, right? It's
yeah. The cache one, I think, is like the most critical one. Although I do think that there's like the particular thing we saw now was a bug, but obviously it is just like a timing game, right? At some point we will run out.
Right, we're gonna go through this rapid action again. And like, okay, Redis is slow. Yeah. What are we gonna do? But no, it's good to have kind of the vision. I also kind of, we gotta step back and figure out, like, is Redis really the long-term approach? Because it sounds like we're just trying to build on top of this thing. And I'm wondering if there's we need to think about, is there something else we need to consider here?
I mean, there's, like, I do feel there's a need for like cluster state, like a way, like something that's not your database, but a place that you can kind of share information between like different nodes. And Redis does a pretty good job at it, but it's obviously abusable as well.
Yeah, to scale it is just really, it's complex, right? Like, I guess anything is going to be complex, but the fact that Redis is a single core process, you hit the limits pretty quickly right away, right?
Like, I've done a few talks recently about just different, like Redis is kind of a great thing to talk about, like monitoring and failures in your system. And like people keep coming to me and saying, oh, KeyDB is the future. And I've never used it. And it's like, I think it'd be a very risky move to make, because if it fails, it'll look really bad. Like, but like a lot of people are saying KeyDB, it's multi-threaded. But what we were saying before you jumped on the call was maybe, like, we know that this is something that is not going to hit many of our clients, and maybe we just pay for Redis, Redis Labs. You know, they've got a partnership with GCP, and we just kind of let them do it, and we just see it as a Redis interface. It's definitely something worth discussing, whether or not that's the approach we take.
You mean Redis as a service and use their service?
Yeah, yeah. So Google, I think, kind of trying to distinguish themselves from Amazon, you know, who basically getting a bit of a reputation for what they do with open source. Like like Google have got this, it's actually Redis Labs, and you provision it through GCP console. But what you get is a Redis Labs, like cloud provisioned instance that's basically supporting Redis Labs and their open source, and, you know, the whole company. So it's kind of an interesting approach to it. But maybe we could go with that because then it's kind of easy to provision. It's actually running, you know, on the same data center and all of those good things as well. Cool.
Cool. Thanks for that summary.
Cool. I'm gonna shut down my sharing.
I need to drop off. Somebody needs to go to sleep.
Yeah, I need to go and say goodnight to my kids as well. So I don't know if we want to tie it up early or if you guys want to hang around.
I think it's good. Thanks for sharing, Andrew.
I think this is the time we allotted for this. So hopefully next month there will be some more folks on.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool.
Thanks a lot, Andrew. Bye bye.
Bye everyone.
Thanks,
Thanks a lot. Bye. Thanks.
Bye.